The marble lobby of Sterling Tower gleamed under the morning sun when Preston Vance stepped over a wet patch a janitor was cleaning. He slipped, caught himself, then turned and dropped his coffee cup onto the spotless tile. "Look at his dirty uniform," he sneered, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "They let things like this near the boardroom?" The janitor knelt and wiped, silent, but his hand paused over a thin crack in the baseboard. The man they stepped over was the only one there who knew the building was already failing. "What would you have done?" His name was Daniel Reed, and he had learned a long time ago that silence was cheaper than pride. He was 38 years old, with the kind of face that people forgot the moment they looked away from it. Every weekday, he worked the night shift at Sterling Tower, pushing a gray cart down empty corridors while the city slept below. He emptied bins, polished glass, and listened to the building the way other men listened to music. He could hear when a vent ran too hot, when an elevator cable hummed at the wrong pitch, when a floor settled half an inch more than it should have. None of it was in his job description, and none of it was something he ever spoke about. By 6 in the morning he was home, in a narrow apartment on the east side of the city, where his daughter Nora was already awake and humming to herself. She was 7, with a gap in her front teeth and a habit of narrating her own breakfast. Daniel made her toast, brushed the tangles out of her hair, and walked her to the small school 4 blocks away. On the corner she stopped and pointed up at the skyline, where the gray tower rose above everything around it, and asked him for the 100th time if that was really where he worked. He told her it was. She squinted at it as though she could see him standing in one of the high windows, then took his hand again, satisfied. He told her it was the best building in the city, and he meant it. He did not tell her, because she was too young to understand, that he had once known that tower better than anyone alive. He did not tell her about the years before she was born, when he had a different life and a different title, when his name had appeared on blueprints instead of time cards. He kept those years folded away, the way a man folds a letter he cannot bring himself to throw out. In his locker at work, behind a spare shirt and a thermos, sat a roll of old structural drawings he had never been able to leave behind. There had been a different Daniel once, in a different decade. He had been a structural engineer with a future bright enough that older men had warned him not to burn it too fast. He had drawn frames for towers and bridges, and had a gift for hearing weakness in steel that no instrument could match. Then his wife had gotten sick, and the months that followed had taken everything, the savings, the practice, the steady ground under his life, and at the end of them he was a widower with an infant daughter, and no strength left for the world that had once been his. He had walked away from all of it. He had taken the first quiet job that would let him keep his hands busy and his nights to himself, and he had told no one his name had ever meant anything. Some men grieve out loud. Daniel had grieved by disappearing, and he had been disappearing for 7 years. The other custodians thought he was strange. He was polite but distant, and he never joined the card games in the break room. The shift supervisor, a tired man named Hollis, liked him well enough but warned him more than once to keep his head down. "Whatever you used to do," Hollis said one night, not unkindly, "you do this now. Don't go touching things that aren't yours." Daniel nodded and said nothing. He had heard versions of that advice his whole life. He had stopped arguing with it. What none of them knew was why a janitor kept a set of engineering drawings locked in a metal cabinet, or why his eyes moved across walls and ceilings, the way a doctor's eyes move across a patient. They saw the uniform. They never thought to look past it. 3 floors above the lobby, the world ran on a different set of rules. Grace Sterling had inherited the company from her father 2 years earlier, and she ran it the way a surgeon runs an operating room, fast and exact and intolerant of waste. At 33, she was the youngest chief executive the firm had ever had, and she had spent every day since proving she had earned the chair rather than been handed it. She was sharp-eyed and composed, the sort of person who could end a meeting with a single sentence and have no one argue. She had reasons to run hard. The firm her father had built had nearly been lost twice in her lifetime, once to a downturn and once to the project that now bore her name, and she had decided long ago that she would not be the Sterling who let it slip. She measured everything against that fear. She kept her doors open and her voice level and her decisions ruthless, and if some people found her cold, she counted that a fair price for keeping 2,000 jobs alive. She had not become hard out of cruelty. She had become hard because softness, in her experience, had cost people everything. The crown of her ambition was the new tower rising beside the original Sterling building, a glass annex meant to double the company's offices and announce to the city that the Sterling name still meant something. The project had nearly collapsed 18 months earlier when costs spiraled, and a lender walked away. It had been saved, everyone agreed, by Preston Vance, a billionaire investor who had joined the board with a check large enough to keep the cranes turning. Since then, he had behaved as though he owned the place, and in a sense he nearly did. That morning the executive floor buzzed with preparation for the ribbon cutting. Now only days away, Grace moved through it briskly, approving banners, confirming the guest list, checking the schedule against the clock in her head. Preston followed her like a man enjoying his own importance, reminding everyone within earshot that without him there would be no tower at all. The staff laughed at his jokes because his money paid their salaries, and he mistook their laughter for affection. At the far end of the floor, where the glass overlooked the service entrance, an older man sat in a leather chair and watched it all in silence. Robert Sterling was 66 now, the founder, Grace's father, and the honorary chairman whose name was still carved above the doors. Illness had thinned him, but his eyes were as clear as ever, and they kept drifting away from the celebration toward the lower corridors, as though he were looking for someone he had not seen in years. Once or twice Grace caught the look on his face and could not read it. She filed it away as nostalgia and went back to her lists. She did not know that her father remembered a name she had never been told. 3 days before the opening, Grace led a small group of investors and reporters on a private tour of the new tower. Preston walked at the front, narrating as though he had poured the concrete himself. Daniel was there too, off to the side, restocking supplies on the mechanical level, invisible in the way the working men always are. As the group passed through a half-finished office floor, a young site technician knelt by a support column with a worried look. Daniel, passing with his cart, slowed and said quietly, "That load rating's wrong. The number on the placard is more than the beam under it can carry. Somebody should check the spec." He said it the way a man states the weather, without heat, and he would have kept walking if Preston had not heard. Preston turned, scenting an audience. "Did the cleaning crew just give us an engineering opinion?" he said, and a few of the guests laughed. He stepped closer, looking Daniel up and down with theatrical disgust. "Look at this, stained uniform, mop water on his shoes, and he wants to lecture the people who built this tower." He raised his voice so the reporters could hear. "This is what happens when you let anyone wander the site. They start imagining they understand things that are above them." Daniel stood very still. The guests had gone quiet, watching, and several of them looked away in embarrassment. Grace was at the front of the group, and for a moment her eyes met Daniel's. She did not step in. To her, it was a small, ugly scene that would resolve itself if she let it pass, and Preston, however crude, was the man whose money held the project together. She gave the smallest nod, as if to say move along, and turned back toward the windows. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the column, then at the placard, and said one number, a load figure precise to the last unit, the kind of figure that no one repeats by accident. Then he set his hand back on his cart and walked on. The young technician went pale. He glanced down at the spec sheet on his clipboard, and the number printed there matched the janitor's exactly. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and looked after the retreating gray uniform with something close to fear. No one else noticed. Grace had already moved on to the view, but the technician stood there a long moment, holding a piece of paper that a man with a mop had just read from memory. For the rest of that day, the moment sat in Daniel like a swallowed stone. He had felt the old anger rise in his chest, the engineer's anger at being talked over by a man who could not read a single line on a drawing, and he had pushed it back down where he kept everything else. He had a daughter to walk home, and a shift to finish. Pride was a luxury he had stopped being able to afford a long time ago. But that evening, when he picked Nora up and she asked him how his day had been, he told her it had been fine, and he listened to her chatter about her day at the kitchen table, and he let the calm of that small bright room put the stone back to sleep. It was not the first time he had quietly been right about that building. Weeks earlier, on an ordinary night, he had stopped beside an elevator bank and listened to a cable that hummed half a tone too high, and the next morning he had left an unsigned note for the maintenance crew describing exactly which sheave was worn. They had found it, replaced it, and never learned who had warned them. Another night he had noticed a hairline of moisture, tracking down a column where no pipe ran, and traced it back to a drainage fault 3 floors up that the official inspections had missed entirely. He fixed what he could reach and reported the rest in notes no one could trace to a janitor, because a janitor's name on an engineering observation would only be thrown away. He had learned to be right invisibly. It was a strange kind of discipline, to know things and to swallow them, and it had worn a quiet groove into him over the years. That night, after the tour and the toasts and the long handshakes, the tower emptied. Daniel finished his rounds on the upper floors and then did something that was not on his schedule. He took the service elevator down to the mechanical level, to the room where the building's sensors fed their data into a bank of monitors, and he stood in front of the screens and read them the way other men read the news. He had been watching for weeks, small things at first. A tremor reading slightly high on the new tower's eastern frame, a vibration signature that climbed a little each night and was smoothed away each morning before the day staff arrived. Tonight it was worse. He pulled out an old phone, its screen webbed with cracks, and photographed the readings, the timestamps, the slow, ugly trend line. Then he checked the official monitoring report that would land on the executives' desks at dawn. It said the structure was nominal. Every figure was clean. Every alarm was green. He stood there for a long time in the blue light, understanding 2 things at once. The first was that the building was being pushed beyond what its frame could bear. The second, colder, was that someone was reaching into the monitoring system every single night and rewriting the truth before anyone could see it. A janitor was not supposed to be able to read raw sensor logs, or know the access path to the engineering floor, or recognize a falsified report on site. Daniel did all 3, and he did not let himself wonder, just then, how strange that must look. He copied the real readings to the old phone, slid it into his pocket, and went back to his cart. On the wall above the monitors, a small green light blinked steadily, lying with perfect confidence. The crisis came 2 nights later, just before dawn. Daniel was on the upper floor of the new tower when he heard it, a sound he had felt in his bones once before, and had hoped never to feel again. It was a deep, dry crack, the sound of steel asking a question it could not answer. He had heard that sound exactly once before in his life, 12 years earlier, on a job site north of the city, and he had spent every year since hoping he would never hear it again. His body knew it before his mind did. He was moving before he had finished thinking, down the stairwell 2 steps at a time, because steel that cracks once will crack again, and the second crack is the one that kills. He found the source on the mechanical level, where a primary support beam had split along a weld, and water from a sheared coolant line was spreading across the floor in a dark sheet. The slab above it had sagged, just slightly, just enough. He moved fast. He shut the coolant valve, cleared the area, and went to the alarm panel to trigger an evacuation hold on the floor. The panel showed nothing. The fault, that should have screamed across every screen in the building, had been silenced at the source. Somewhere, a green light still blinked. He did the only thing left to him. He dragged a barrier of equipment across the stairwell entrance to the failing floor, taped off the elevator doors, and stationed himself in front of them. When the first managers arrived and told him to step aside, he refused. When they threatened his job, he refused again calmly, the way a man refuses to move off a railroad track because he can hear the train. He would not let anyone onto that floor, and he would not leave it, and he stayed there in the dark, with the water spreading behind him until someone with the authority to listen finally came. Grace's phone rang at 4 in the morning. By the time she arrived, hair pulled back and face unreadable, a small crowd of night staff and hastily summoned managers had gathered in the lobby. Preston was already there, in a coat thrown over pajamas, and he was talking fast and loud. "It's a minor fault," he said. "A cracked weld, a leak. These things happen on every site. We patch it, we move on, and we open on schedule. We have investors flying in. We have press. We do not panic over a wet floor." Grace looked toward the new tower, where a single light burned on the mechanical level. "Has anyone been up?" she asked. A manager said the night custodian had reported the fault and refused to leave the floor. Preston's face darkened. "The janitor," he said, as if the word itself were an insult. "The same one who's been playing engineer all week. Get him out of my building." But she stood in the cold lobby with 2 competing truths in front of her. On one side was a billionaire whose money she needed and whose certainty filled the room. On the other was a man in a stained uniform with a cracked phone, asking her to believe that everyone she trusted had been wrong, or worse. Everything in her training told her to side with the board, with the contracts, with the certified report that said the building was fine, and yet she had built her whole career on noticing when a clean number was hiding a dirty one, and the report in Preston's voice was a little too clean, a little too loud. She did not trust Daniel yet. She trusted the gap between those two graphs, and the gap was real. Grace did not give that order. Something in the way her father had looked at the service corridors, something in the young technician's face during the tour, something she could not name had been gathering in her for days. "No," she said quietly. "Bring him here. I want to hear what he saw." Daniel came down still in his stained uniform, the cracked phone in his hand. He did not look at Preston. He walked to Grace, and in a low, even voice he laid it out. The failed weld, the silenced alarm, the water on the floor, the sag in the slab. Then he turned the phone toward her and showed her two things side by side. The first was the official monitoring report, all green, all nominal. The second was the raw sensor log he had photographed himself. The tremor climbing night after night, the truth that someone had been erasing before sunrise. "This building has been telling you it was in trouble for 3 weeks, he said. Someone kept turning off the part of the system that could hear it. The lobby went very quiet. Preston laughed, but it came out thin. "And we should believe a man who mops floors over a certified monitoring contractor? He could have made that up on his phone in 5 minutes." He appealed to the managers around him. "This is theater. We are days from opening. I will not let a custodian with a grudge cost us this project." Grace did not answer him. She was looking at the two screens, at the green report and the climbing line, and at the man in the gray uniform who had refused to leave a failing floor at 4 in the morning. She did not believe him yet. She was too careful for that. But for the first time, she was not dismissing him. She was watching him, the way she watched a number that did not add up, and she said, "Don't touch anything in that tower until I understand this, including the schedule." Preston's jaw tightened. Behind Daniel, at the edge of the crowd, the young technician from the tour had appeared in the doorway, pale and silent, holding the same clipboard he had carried 3 days before. Grace called an emergency review for that afternoon, and she did something her father would have done and Preston would not have expected. She had the original construction archive pulled from storage, the first set of structural drawings made when the new tower was nothing but a hole in the ground. While the engineers argued over sensor data in a glass conference room, Daniel asked for one thing. He asked to see those drawings. They spread the sheets across the long table. Daniel found the structural plan, the one that defined every beam and weld and load path in the building, and he set his finger near the bottom corner, on the title block where the lead engineer always signs. The room leaned in to look. The signature read D. Reed. For a moment no one spoke. Then Grace looked up from the page to the man across the table, the janitor in the stained uniform, and the name on the drawing and the name on his locker became impossibly the same name. "You designed this," she said. It was not quite a question. "I designed the frame," Daniel said, 12 years ago, before the company that built it changed hands, before the project stalled, before any of you were standing here." He looked at the sheet the way a man looks at an old photograph. "I left the field a long time ago. I had my reasons, but I built this tower to stand, and it is not standing the way I built it." Grace looked at him for a long moment, recalibrating everything. She thought of the column on the tour, the load figure he had recited from memory, the way the young technician's face had drained of color. She thought of how easily she had knotted a man with a mop out of a room, and how the man with the mop had turned out to know this building down to its bones. The pieces did not rearrange gently. They fell into a new shape all at once, and the new shape made her slightly sick. The room erupted. Preston was on his feet, his voice climbing over the others. "This is absurd. He stole these documents. A man like that, with access to every floor at night, he could have planted his own name in the archive. You're going to take the word of a janitor with a forged signature over the entire board?" He was shouting now, and the shouting itself was strange, because no one had yet accused him of anything. Grace held up one hand, and the room fell silent. She studied Daniel, and then she studied Preston, and she filed away how loud one man was and how quiet the other had stayed. "If the original design was sound," she said slowly, to no one in particular, "then someone changed it. The frame didn't fail on its own. Either the man who drew it is lying, or someone rebuilt his tower wrong. She looked at Daniel. I need proof, not your phone, not your memory. Proof I can put in front of the board. Then give me the procurement records, Daniel said. The material orders for the structural steel. The drawings tell you what the building was supposed to be made of. The orders will tell you what it was actually made of. And the difference between those two numbers is the reason that beam cracked tonight. For the first time, Preston Vance did not have anything to say. The full board convened the next morning in the largest conference room on the executive floor, with the city spread out gray and enormous beyond the glass. Word had traveled, and the room was full. Reporters waited downstairs. The opening was now 2 days away, and on the table sat the question of whether it would happen at all, and whose career would survive the answer. Preston seized the floor before Grace could open the meeting. He had recovered his footing overnight and arrived armed with certainty. Members of the board, he said, we are being held hostage by a fantasy. A night janitor with a grievance has spun a story about secret signatures and falsified data, and somehow it has reached this table. I have invested more in this company than any of you. I will not watch that investment burn because a man with a mop wants to feel important. I move that we dismiss this employee, open the tower on schedule, and put this circus behind us. A few board members nodded. Money has its own gravity, and Preston had a great deal of it. Grace let him finish. Then she said, before we vote, we'll hear from the engineer who drew the original frame. She did not say the janitor. She said the engineer, and the word landed in the room like a small stone in still water. Daniel rose. He had not changed his clothes. The uniform was the only armor he had, and he wore it the way other men wear a suit. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the screen at the front of the room and put up 2 images. The first was the certified monitoring report, all of it green, signed off night after night. The second was the raw sensor data he had pulled from the system himself, the tremor in the new tower's frame climbing steadily across 3 weeks. This is what the board was shown, he said, touching the green report, and this is what the building was actually doing. He touched the second graph. The 2 lines lay across each other, one flat and calm, one rising toward the edge of the screen, and the gap between them was impossible to argue with. For 3 weeks the building had been screaming and no one had heard it, because someone had unplugged its voice. Daniel let that thought settle over the table before he said another word. He had spent 7 years staying silent in rooms exactly like this one, and he had learned that silence, used at the right moment, was louder than any speech. He did not shout. He set the tip of one finger on the single point where the 2 lines diverged, the night the lie had begun, and he held it there, and he said, very quietly, right here, someone decided you didn't need to know. The room went completely silent. No one coughed. No one shifted. The only sound was the faint hum of the building itself. Then Daniel put up a third image, and the silence changed its quality. It was a procurement record, a steel order from the period of construction, and beside it the original specification from his own drawings. The grades did not match. The drawings called for a high-strength structural steel rated for the loads the tower would carry. The orders, signed and approved, were for a cheaper alloy, lighter, weaker, a fraction of the cost. The frame in that tower, Daniel said, is not the frame I designed. Somebody swapped the steel after the plans were approved, and then somebody spent 3 weeks teaching the monitoring system to hide what that weaker steel was doing under load. He turned, for the first time, and looked directly at Preston. The approval signature on these orders isn't mine. It's yours. Preston came apart all at once. That's a lie, he shouted, half rising. Those substitutions were standard cost engineering, approved by the whole project. You can't pin that on one man. The budget was collapsing and I saved it. I saved all of you, and you'd rather he stopped. But it was already too late, because in his fury, he had admitted the substitution he had spent 2 days denying. The room had heard it. The reporters' names on the guest list downstairs had not, but everyone at the table had. It was then that Robert Sterling stood up. The old man had been sitting at the far end of the table, so quiet that some had forgotten he was there. He rose slowly, one hand braced on the wood, and the whole room turned toward him, because when the founder stood, you listened. His eyes were fixed on Preston, and his voice, when it came, was steady and worn and absolutely clear. 12 years ago, Robert said, I was on a job site north of this city when a floor gave way beneath me. I was 64 years old, and I was certain I was going to die under 1,000 tons of concrete. A young engineer I barely knew came back into a collapsing structure that everyone else was running out of, and he carried me out over his shoulder, and the slab came down behind us. He paused, and his hand tightened on the table. That engineer's name was Daniel Reed. I have wondered for 12 years what became of him, and now I find that while we were applauding the man who supposedly saved this project, the man who actually saved my life has been emptying our trash at night because he was too proud to ask any of us for help. He turned his gaze on Preston, and there was nothing kind in it. You called his uniform dirty. That dirty uniform carried me out of a building you would have let fall. You will want to be very careful about what you say next. No one moved. Grace was looking at her father, and then at Daniel, and the careful distance she had kept her whole professional life had cracked straight down the middle. The room was utterly still. Grace had not known this story. Her father had never told her, in all the years she had sat across dinner tables from him, that a stranger had once carried him out of a dying building, or that the stranger had vanished and left him wondering. She looked at her father, then at the man in the gray uniform, and understood that the two most important men in the room had carried the same secret in opposite directions for 12 years, and that she had walked between them every day without seeing either one. The rest came quickly, the way these things do once the first beam goes. The board ordered the building's full data logs unsealed, and the system's own history did the work Daniel's phone could not. Every night for 3 weeks, the access record showed the same credential, reaching into the monitoring software and overwriting the structural alarms before dawn. The credential belonged to a contractor Preston had personally hired and personally paid, outside the company's normal channels, and the payment records were sitting in the procurement files he had insisted no one needed to open. The security footage from the mechanical level showed the same contractor entering after midnight, again and again, on the exact nights the data had been changed. Preston tried to talk over it. He invoked his money, his influence, the lawyers he would unleash, the careers he would end. But the numbers were on the screen now, and numbers do not flinch. The procurement records showed the steel he had swapped. The access logs showed the alarms he had silenced. The footage showed the man he had paid to do it. Each piece alone might have been explained away. Together they formed a single straight line, and at the end of that line was one man in a coat thrown over pajamas, growing smaller as he shouted. When the board called the vote, it was not close. Preston Vance was removed from the board and stripped of his role in the project. His investment frozen pending the inquiry that everyone in the room understood was coming. The opening was postponed. Engineers were brought in before noon to begin assessing the swapped frame, working from the original drawings, the ones signed D. Reed, that a janitor had kept in a metal locker for 12 years. As the room emptied and the lawyers closed in around Preston, Grace crossed to where Daniel still stood by the screen. She looked at him for a long moment, and she was not looking at him the way a chief executive looks at an employee. She was looking at him the way a person looks at someone they have badly misjudged and only just realized it. I had you escorted away from a column you were right about, she said. I nodded at a man to move you along while he humiliated you, and you were the only person in that tower who knew it was failing. She did not apologize in so many words. She was not built that way, and he would not have wanted it, but the respect in her voice was real, and it had been earned the hard way with evidence, which was the only way she knew how to give it. You were protecting your company, Daniel said. You just didn't know yet who was actually doing the same thing. Word of what had happened moved through the company in a single day, the way such stories do. By evening, the men and women on the night crew who had worked beside Daniel for years without knowing him looked at him a little differently, not with awe, which he would have hated, but with the plain respect one working person gives another who has been proven honest. Hollis, the supervisor who had once told him not to touch things that weren't his, found him in the corridor and said only, I should have asked what you used to do. Daniel told him it was all right. He had never blamed anyone for seeing the uniform. He had counted on it. In the weeks that followed, the new tower was taken apart and rebuilt the way it should have been built the first time. Daniel's original frame was restored beam by beam, the cheap steel cut out and the proper grade welded in, every weld inspected against the drawings in his hand. The opening, when it finally came, was quieter than the one Preston had planned, with no ribbon and no fanfare. Just a building that would stand for 100 years and the people who had made sure it would. The inquiry into Preston Vance grew into something far larger than one building, but Daniel paid little attention to it. He had never wanted Preston ruined. He had only wanted the tower to stand. The lawyers and the headlines belonged to a world he had walked away from long ago, and he let them have it. What he cared about was the steel, and the people who would one day fill the floors above it, and the daughter who believed, without needing to be told, that her father's work mattered. Grace offered Daniel the role that had always, in truth, been his. Not out of guilt, and not out of pity, but because the proof had been laid in front of her and she followed proof wherever it led. She asked him to come back as the firm's chief structural engineer, to oversee the tower he had drawn before she ever sat in the chair. He took a long time to answer. He had built a small, careful life out of silence, and stepping back into the world he had left meant carrying old grief into the open. But he thought of the drawings in his locker, and the years he had spent listening to buildings no one would let him save, and he said yes. In the months that followed, Grace found herself seeking Daniel out more than the work strictly required. She told herself it was because he understood the building better than anyone, and that was true, but it was not the whole of it. She had spent her life around men who filled rooms with their own importance, and here was one who emptied them with his silence, who answered a question only when he had something worth saying. She caught herself watching the careful way he handled a drawing, the way he knelt to a child's eye level, the way he never once mentioned the morning she had nodded him out of a room. Neither of them named it. They worked side by side over the unfolding plans. Two people who had misread each other badly and were learning slowly to read each other right. On a bright afternoon near the end of it all, Nora came to see where her father worked. She ran across the polished lobby and threw her arms around his knees, then tipped her head all the way back to take in the height of the place, the way children do when a thing is too big to fit in their eyes. It's even taller from inside, she announced to anyone who would listen, and Robert Sterling, watching from a nearby chair, laughed for the first time in a long while. Grace stood a little apart, by the windows, and watched the man and his daughter, and did not interrupt. Daniel knelt to her level, and let her tell him, in great detail, how many floors she had counted on the way up, and then he stood and crossed to a side table, where a paper coffee cup had been left behind by some careless visitor. He picked it up, the way he had once knelt to wipe a billionaire's spilled coffee from this same floor, and he set it neatly in the bin. There was no anger in the gesture, and no triumph. There was only a man doing what he had always done, taking care of a place that mattered to him, whether or not anyone was watching. He had spent 7 years believing the world had no more use for him, that the best he could offer it now was a clean floor and a quiet shift. He had been wrong about that, though it had taken a cracked beam and a falling man and a daughter's faith to show him. The uniform had never been the truth of him. It had only been the thing people looked at instead of looking closer. The light came through the glass and fell across the lobby floor, across the founder and the chief executive, and the engineer in a clean new uniform, and across a small girl craning her neck to see the top of a tower that would not fall. Respect had come late, but it had come, at last, to the right man.